Saturday's assassination attempt against former President Donald Trump has brought to light past assassinations and attempts on other former U.S. presidents and the country's reactions after. KTRE's Vanessa Johnson reports the last similar attempt was in 1981, you'll remember, on President Ronald Reagan.
The assassination attempt that left Donald Trump with a wounded ear harkens back to other attempts and assassinations on both former and sitting presidents. The most similar and most recent being in March of 1981 when John Hinckley shot Ronald Reagan. Dale Wilbur with the Associated Press remembers covering it.
The parallels between this and what happened to Reagan to me are front and center to me. Both men are shot at.
Both Reagan and Trump were injured. Reagan's injury much more serious. A bullet went through Reagan's left armpit, almost hitting his heart, causing him to lose a significant amount of blood and being life-threatening.
He also believed he had been spared for a purpose, and that purpose was to help reduce the threat of nuclear war, which helped guide his entire presidency.
There have been many failed attempt plots on past presidents, but only 4 were actually assassinated, including the 16th President Abraham Lincoln, the 20th James Garfield, the 25th William McKinley, and the 35th John F. Kennedy. While Trump's campaign moves forward, history shows an assassination attempt can sway both the candidacy and the country.
I think it'll be really interesting to see what happens about what this does for the American public's relationship with Trump, because Reagan was so affable. He diffused so many situations with humor and kindness, and he was easier to like, and our times were not as polarized in 1981 as they are today.
Vanessa Johnson, KLTV 7 News.
The last time an assassination attempt was made on a former not sitting president was in 1912, Teddy Roosevelt.